Welcome, everyone. I have taught this class sort of many times for about probably 13 years, I think, that we've been offering it. So it morphs and changes. The first thing I want to get to, though, is the part that's most interesting to everyone, and that is, what is Buddhism all about? So there's a Buddha there. That's the Buddha in Kamakura, but what is Buddhism all about? So there's sort of a sense that the Buddha offered a philosophical framework or an understanding. Maybe philosophical framework sounds kind of useless. The Buddha's point was that his view or his understanding, what we would call just right understanding, is very useful. It's also accurate. It describes the world around us and our experience as sentient beings in an accurate way, as opposed to a distorted way or a fanciful way that most systems tend to wander off. Or it's like self-serving way. That's a common. Systems often will figure out how they can help themselves. So we say the historical Buddha to refer to the closest Buddha to us. But there have been many, many Buddhas, both on Earth and anywhere in the universe. Anywhere where there are sentient beings, enlightenment can occur. And we can talk about what enlightenment is, but let's just, for now, use the short definition, which is seeing reality as it really is. And it's easy to say, well, I see reality right now. Well, maybe not. We all have artifact, leftover karmic consciousness from all our life experience before that colors and distorts things. And there's deeper delusions that we operate under, and that's what the Buddha pointed out. So before the Buddha, Siddhartha was a Buddha. He was a prince. And in a small kingdom in what is now Nepal, India, kind of on the border there, foothills of the Himalayas, we could call it. And even as a child, he noticed that there was this kind of hard to pin down, uncomfortable feeling. And that contrasts with kind of a sustained, joyful feeling. So for some reason, he recognized that people could be in a positive, joyful, peaceful state all the time, and yet they weren't. And that became kind of the focus of his spiritual quest. It was often something that when he was younger and his father wanted him to become a king, that he was discouraged from thinking about. If you start asking questions, they'd hand him a sword and say, here, practice with your sword. Because you want a prince to be a prince, right? That was his father, Suddhodana's goal. So his father started kind of fighting against the spiritual power of the son. And he did that by protecting him and isolating and keeping him in the palace and keeping him from seeing the way life really was. Now, he did manage to sneak out, oddly enough. If you keep someone, a child in, the first thing they're going to do is figure out that the window works just as well as the door, and like that. And he snuck out of the palace. He was a prince, so he didn't go by himself. He went with his, I guess they call him a groom, the guy that took care of his horse, right? Was his friend, sort of a little bit, maybe a little bit older, but a similar age. And he went out and he saw these 4 sights. It's a long story, but each time he snuck out, there would be one sight that shocked him. Now, the first one being sickness, isolated in the palace, protected, just wasn't exposed, that makes sense. Old age, the first time he saw an old person, he didn't know what was happening. Why is this person bent like that? Why do they seem to be struggling and weak? It didn't make sense. Well, he'd been sheltered so much to tamp down the spiritual quest in him that he didn't really know what that was. And it was a shocking experience. All of us have kind of seen all these foresights all the time, so we don't really let them in and let their import in as much. But because he'd been sheltered, it was a shocking, powerful experience. Then one time he snuck out and they saw a funeral procession. And in India, 2,600 years ago, a funeral procession is a dead body on a board and some family people carrying it, crying, going to the river. And at the river, they cremated the body. And he hadn't been exposed to any of that. Even death hadn't really been something he'd been part of. And the pain of the family having lost their dear one was, dramatic and moving to him, and planted those important seeds in his heart. So he started to see that and maybe because of his sheltered experience growing up, everything was kind of rosy and fun. It's a palace, right? And then when he snuck out, he saw that it's not actually like that. And there was this contrast that came to him. The last time he snuck out, he saw someone, a religious person, this is the bhikkhu, a religious person, and when he saw the person walking along, he felt like they were sort of glowing. There was a lightness about them, a brightness about them, something like that. And that was a whole new idea, that you could actually see spiritual energy in people. Obviously, if he was sheltered, and his father was trying to get him to not do that, that would have been one of the things he would be most protected from. So seeing all those four things, he came to this fundamental question of why aren't people joyful, or why aren't they happy, or why do they suffer? A lot of different ways we can ask that question. In a lot of Buddhism books, they kind of really hammer on suffering. You're reading like chapter after chapter about suffering. And it sounds like Buddhism is no fun, Everybody in Buddhism, there's an upward kind of happy, joyful. I mean, think of the Dalai Lama. He can be serious. But even when he's serious and he corrects somebody, he's kind of joyful about it. So that's why we're framing the question in terms of why aren't people joyful? So that became a question, an important seeker's question. Now, when things aren't going right, it's quite useful to reflect on our life, because there are probably causes, there are probably reasons things are happening. Some of those may be our choices, some of them may be objective circumstances around us, not implying everybody has control over everything. We don't. But just observing is very important, as opposed to reacting or emoting or, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in social media where people seem to get like totally enraged, or they say I'm passionate about it, but really I think you're just totally freaking out of control. And calming down and seeing things clearly, we want to use the word objectively, but objectively is not a popular word in modern education. See things as they are. See all the different sides of questions and ideas. So, when the Buddha looked deeply into people's lives in the capital city of their kingdom, which was really a city-state, so it's a smallish place, he noticed that throughout that there was this sense of life being a bumpy road, that there may be smooth patches, but then there's always potholes and challenges, and it rains really hard, or it snows, or difficulties occur. And that's natural and normal. And this word dukkha, we'll talk about it a little more later, but it gets translated as suffering, but that's not very good translation. I mean, deep down, it kind of means dragging. It refers to a wheel on a wagon that's not quite right. So when you have that shopping cart in the store with the wheel not quite right, it's just a little harder to push. It takes a little more energy to keep it going. It tends to stall out. It may swerve in strange directions, or the wheel just goes, So that's what dukkha is, the quality of life that just kind of drags things back. And it may actually be, in the sum total of drag, there's more drag on every little moment of life than there is when the big, terrible things happen, when you get in the giant 26-car accident on the summit and you find a dead body, which did happen to me one time. That was a giant traumatic experience. There's certain trucking brands, when I see them on the freeway, I immediately flash back to that, because there were all these trucks and cars and they were all smashed together, and it made this dramatic image in my mind. But that isn't what the Buddha was talking about. Mostly he was talking about all the little things every single day that just kind of wear entropy kind of feeling, like if you put 10 units of energy into something, you always seem to get 3 back out. And then where did that extra deficit of energy go? Toward this dukkha, the bumpy feeling. Another really important insight he had was that life has an impermanent quality. And more than just impermanent, it's constantly changeful. And when I mentioned the passing of Thich Nhat Hanh, the wonderful Buddhist priest from Vietnam, that changefulness, we experience it as though it is not good, but really it is absolutely essential and wonderful, and the source of all the vibrant qualities in life is that things change. So, but just seeing anicca, seeing changefulness is important. In our culture, where there are so many things that are built around the idea of permanence, that it's actually hard for us to accept deeply that idea. The number of people that don't want the way they look to change, or when you were a kid, you always wanted to get older, but as soon as you were an adult, then you didn't want to get older. Well, it turns out that wonderful natural process of maturing into a new person each day is really what's great about life. And you enjoyed it as a child, but it doesn't need to stop. It can't stop. And it hurts us to think it should stop. Because when you look in the mirror and you feel disappointed because, what's that thing? I don't know, what is that thing? I'm looking at an imaginary mirror here. It doesn't make you feel better, good, it's a drag. So it goes into the category of dukkha, that little bit of suffering that we sort of inflict on ourselves because we don't accept the changeful nature of our body, of life, of everything beyond that, community, universe, everything, constantly changing. Another wonderful and interesting thing the Buddha started noticing was everything is interdependent, is what the slide says. I agree. How to say it, though? Anatta, the Pali word next to, means non-self. Atta means self or soul or something like that. And the Buddha recognized that actually everything had the quality of non-self. Nothing really has a separate, self-existent, what did Plato call that? He had a word for that. Essence or something like that. Right, the forms. Did you say form? Okay, my hearing's a little impaired, and masks make it really hard for me. So, that idea that a stool has essence of stool in it. Ooh, that didn't go well. Let's use a different word. The idea that a book has essence of book in it is, ancient Platonic idea, right? The Buddha said, no. It doesn't. The deeper you look at the book, the more other things you see. It's made of wood. Wood comes from trees. Trees grow in the soil. They drink in sunlight and water and nutrients from the soil. All these things are present in the book. So its separate existence as a book is actually much more questionable than saying it doesn't have a separate existence as a book. The deeper we dig into things, the more we see these interconnections. Now, if you're walking across the street and there's a bus coming, it is not a good idea to say, oh, I'm just one with the bus. No. Practically, we do, I will hand you a book. The Buddha talked about the self all the time when he was teaching. But one of his teachings was there's no such thing as a self. Well, that's confusing. So from our perspective, as unenlightened beings, there are selves. Each of us has one. Some of us have many. Some of us have a few. And that's okay. The Buddha came to connect with us where we were at. Upaya, that's called, skillful means. So that's the reason sometimes we'll say there is no self, but then we'll start talking about self for a long time. It's like, well, wait a second. If you try to talk about the world without self in it, it is very confusing. Some sutras do that. The Heart Sutra is a great example of that. It is very confusing because it doesn't quite make sense. Even making sentences without the idea of separate self-existence is quite challenging because the subject and the object can't be separated anymore. So sentences fall apart. That's the Buddha world. A Buddha can see and understand all of that. I'm just a Buddhist priest in a temple, so I present the material, but I am a fellow traveler with all of you. I actually teach these classes so that I can learn from you and your questions and your insights so that I can understand Buddhism onward. I wouldn't say more because it's not a contest, but I'm just understanding it onward from this experience. And that's another piece of interdependence. When you think of someone, a dear one who has passed, sometimes I look at my hands, and it's weird because they look so much like my dad's hands. They're got cuts and scars, they're kind of stocky in a way. My hands didn't look like that. Well, they didn't. They do now. And they're kind of like him. Or ideas. Have you ever noticed yourself saying some little phrase that a dear one always said, and you think, or maybe sometimes it's one of those, I'll never do that, and then you do. Well, we're all interconnected in many wonderful ways. There's even times when you find yourself saying something that someone you really dislike always used to say at work, but it's become part of you, and it actually makes sense, and you can kind of forgive them a little bit for all their other trespasses because that one thing they said was kind of clever, and it made sense of the world for you. Usually we don't want to admit that, and we want to kind of make walls, but we can open to that. Opening to the interdependence of everything. Thich Nhat Hanh's wonderful way of describing this is to be empty of separateness. Empty of what? Empty of separateness. So you can't just be empty, because if a glass is empty of tea, then it's full of air, right? That's sort of one of those things. Same thing with this. If we're empty of separateness, then non-self is the nature of everything, and that's what that's about. The last piece that the Buddha noticed is kind of the premise where he noticed when people weren't as happy as they could be, but Nibbana is we're used to nirvana, which is Sanskrit. Nibbana is Pali. They mean the same thing. They're just two different languages from India. Religious languages useful for communicating these kinds of ideas. The Buddha noticed, and we all notice this, that there are times life is just quite wonderful. It's just amazing. And depending on where we're at, we can walk around and look at the little tree branch sitting there with the little broken end on it and a kind of a leaf sitting there and see the wonder in that. And that Nibbana, that wonderful, interconnected, joyful quality is actually part of everything. We don't see it all the time because we're stumbling over these other bits. But so he saw those foresights, and that really energized his quest as a religious seeker person. I do occasionally need to pause and ask if there are any questions, if anything brought anything up. If I forgot to mention one, sometimes I'll go through two of them and leave the other two and forget and then move on, and you go, whoa, wait. So, yes? Yes. So, the languages of northern India 2,600 years ago are very distant from us. But each country apparently had their own little language. In Magadha, they spoke Magadhan or whatever. And so in Shakya, that's the kingdom the Buddha grew up in, they spoke Shakyan, right? And so having a language you could talk about religious and philosophical ideas in was important. It was the first time that writing actually became practical and useful, other than scribes for the emperor kind of stuff. And so the Pali language is a precursor to Sanskrit. Sanskrit is used extensively in Hinduism, and many Indian regional languages, of which there are like 116 regional languages in India. Some of them do have deep roots back into Sanskrit. But those are, so the way Latin and Greek relate to Christianity, Pali and Sanskrit relate to Buddhism. Okay. And I like those words, and I like what they mean. You cut them apart. Like if you want something to be the opposite of something, you just put it on in front of it. So anicca, icca is permanence, anicca is impermanence. We have that in English. If we put im before permanent, you get that. So anyway, they're wonderful, fun languages. So it's good to learn the words and kind of dig into them or let them settle with you. We've heard all these Buddhist words before through popular culture or maybe in university or something like that. Some of them get translated, and then it's a problem because the translation you first heard was sort of way off. So with a lot of Buddhist words, we like to just here's the word, learn it, kind of work up your own sense of meaning to it. Provisionally, sure, we can use an English equivalent, but they're never really very good equivalents. There are always little holes in it. So those 4 marks of existence are essential to the Buddha's viewpoint and his quest to understand. The story of the Buddha actually is depicted on 6 wonderful paintings that are painted by you can turn around and look at them, they're back against the wall. We will talk about that next time. He was born, he was a prince, he saw the 4 sights, he was enlightened under a Bodhi tree, he taught, and then he died by the side of the road when he was 88 years old. Okay, we'll talk about those later. The point is that as he quested, he studied with teachers for a while, and then he went kind of independent, and because he'd learned a bunch of meditation techniques, and he had good frameworks, but they didn't quite answer this question of why do they suffer? Why aren't they happy? Why can't they, if joy is present in everything, the 4th of the marks of existence, then why don't people feel it? That question took him to study independently. Unfortunately, his last teacher taught him that it was because we were impure that we don't enjoy everything. So he thought that maybe if he didn't eat or drink food, that he would purify his body, that food was from the earth, and the earth is dirty, so if you eat food, isn't it logical to say if you stop eating, you purify yourself, right? And there's still strong threads of that in Hinduism today. When you see a yogi sleeping on a bed of nails, it's not an accident. They're trying to that searing pain. They theorize that it will purify our physical form. The Buddha rejected all that, but at the time he was studying it. Went off on his own, lost a lot of weight. I don't know if you've ever seen that statue, very famous statue in Pakistan of him, and he just absolutely emaciated, almost just a human skeleton sitting there meditating, and realized that was a mistake because he almost died. Started eating food again, sat underneath the Bodhi tree, which is the famous enlightenment tree in Bodh Gaya, and in Gaya, I guess would be the right way to say that. And he found what we call enlightenment. And enlightenment consists in, the way he taught it, the first time he taught, what we call Four Noble Truths. So you can say Four Wonderful Truths. In Pali, it's Arya, so Aryan has some bad connotations around lately, so we kind of skip over that. We just say noble, because that's what they meant. They didn't mean anything about 20th century historical politics. Let's talk about those. And we've touched on the ideas there because that's what the Buddha was grappling with. The first noble truth that he realized in his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree is that life is joyful, but people experience it with suffering, which is kind of a strange, contradictory thing. And it's really that first question that he came to was, why is this happening? The second noble truth is a thing that happens has a cause. Maybe that's the best way to say it. So the cause of not being joyful. The third noble truth is that if you take that cause away, the cause of not being joyful, you'll be joyful. You know, that kind of makes sense. If there's a tack in your shoe and you're stepping on it and it hurts, if you take the tack out, it will no longer hurt and you'll be back to a peaceful state. And then the fourth noble truth is the path to a joyful life has 8 important aspects. So has anyone heard of the Eightfold Path before? Okay, sure. Our Buddhist symbol, the Dharma chakra, the Dharma wheel, has 8 spokes. In Pali, the word is limb, because they made the spokes of wheels out of tree limbs in the old days, but that's the reason. We say fold in English. I don't really know what folds have to do, but it works. We get it. There's 8 aspects. They're interdependent. The wheel symbol is very important because I had one here, but it's obscured. Because the way wheels work is all the spokes are interdependent, right? And that keeps the hub in the center. And interesting, too, the word dukkha, the suffering word, was about wheels, too. So it may have been 2,600 years ago, people were really excited about this technology of the wheel, and the technology of the wheel sort of is infused in the Buddha's teaching because that was like the height. Maybe now, if somebody got enlightened, they'd talk about how computers work and how the memory registers and that kind of stuff. But at the time, wheel was just it is a wonderful, simple symbol of interdependence. Yet, each spoke is a thing. It has its quality and character. So those 8 folds of the Eightfold Path are all the spokes of the wheel, and I've got them listed there. So let's look at the Noble Truths. Life can be joyful. Now, you may have read this in some other book, and it usually says life is suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path to no more suffering. I just said suffering like 5 times. It's really a drag. It's not helpful. It doesn't really take us anywhere in particular. It just kind of, So we say life can be joyful. Why we are not joyful is the second noble truth. And the end of that cause of non-joy is the third noble truth. And the path to a joyful life has 8 folds to it. So, not being joyful. Oddly enough, the Dharma talk tomorrow is about cultivating joy in your life. So this brings up a whole bunch of ideas, and I'd like to edit that, but I don't get to do that because we're just kind of going to go work our way through it here now. Come tomorrow if you're interested. You'd be welcome to come to the Dharma talk and see what's going on with that. This idea that life is inherently joyful, but we don't experience it that way, is really interesting. It's sort of like if you watched this happens, some old funny TV show, that everybody thinks is funny, like Seinfeld. Doesn't almost everybody think Seinfeld is funny? But if you sit with someone from another country with them and watch a Seinfeld episode, you will find yourself explaining everything in it. And they might get to the point of saying, well, I guess I could see how that might be funny. But they don't actually laugh. So what's happening there? There's some kind of a, let's use an analogy from modern technology. There's some kind of a software overlay thing, culture in our mind and how we experience ourselves and the world around us that colors or distorts or filters what we take in. So in the case of the Seinfeld episode, the fact that Kramer always opens the door really fast and bursts in is funny to us. But maybe in Japan, people would think, oh, this is a rude person. No, rude people aren't funny, they're just rude. And it doesn't make sense to laugh at things that are really wrong or, peel away at the fabric of community. So Kramer's not funny in that context. He also did a bunch of other things that weren't funny, but we're not going to talk about those now. So, same thing kind of going on here. Life, the experience of this fantastic, miraculous sentience that we have, or that we're part of, or that we're this consciousness that we have, or maybe we're part of a bigger consciousness, and we just experience it in our own bubble. Wonderful, joyful, fantastic, miraculous, and yet, has anybody complained today? I know I have already several times. So what are you complaining about? That overlay of looking at what's not there, or looking at what we want to be there that isn't there, or looking at things that are there with the overtone of, but it could be better, is a large part of the problem. So that feeling of dis-ease, of discomfort with life around us, is what the dukkha idea is. I talked about the wonky wheel a little bit. There is, in Pali, if you say dukkha dukkha, which sounds kind of funny, but it's not supposed to be humorous, that's like if you got a nail stuck in your hand. That is the suffering of suffering. It's like absolute, obvious physical suffering. And that occurs. But most of the time, that pervasive experience of just kind of being dragged down by all the little things that don't go right, that's what the Buddha was talking about when he talked about dukkha. So the second noble truth is, what is the cause of us not experiencing life joyfully? Tanha literally means thirst. But I usually translate it in English as wanting, because thirst is when you want water. It's, think about anything. If you get a new iPhone, you're all excited about it. Before you get it, there's much more excitement, and once you get something, it's kind of not as wonderful. And if you've noticed, in about 6 months, they come out with a new iPhone, and your new iPhone is not new anymore. So you get kind of trapped by that the changefulness part. You're thirsting for something, then when you have it, it melts away for you. We just want things to stay the same. When you get that new car and someone accidentally scrapes it with a shopping cart a week after you got it, it is very upsetting. And yet, it's just a car, it's a little scratch, and it's going to get lots more scratches eventually. But we have so much pinned to the idea of it being permanently new that we are disturbed by it. And these are trivial examples, but I tend to stick with the trivial examples because they're not as painful. But we all experience those in some way. Wanting things to be other than they are is a fundamental tanha, a fundamental thirst. If you have the unfortunate occasion of watching the news too much or social media too much, you get a lot of that. It's almost all about how things aren't the way they should be. Well, but they are the way they are. And if they shouldn't be the way they are, then why are they like that? It's an interesting puzzle. And part of the wonderful, nurturing, loving, peaceful quality of the temple is acceptance. Now, that doesn't mean when things are harming people, we wouldn't stand up for that. Of course we would. But we also accept that things are the way they are. Now, and Buddhism being a middle way, we can do both of those things, and it's okay. some worldview, some religious viewpoints see the universe as a battle between good and evil. So anytime you're not fighting for good, you're part of the evil. This is a very problematic way to look at reality. So we avoid that. So tanha, this thirsting for things to be other than they are, was the second noble truth. And it was a big deal because once he identified that, the idea of, samudaya. Okay, so once he saw that, then he could start to, sometimes when you see the cause of something, it just kind of evaporates. Sometimes you have to dig into it deeper understanding. The further that the Buddha looked at things, the more that sense of suffering kind of melted away. Does that make sense? I need to read this slide because I haven't read anything. So, this all interrelates. So changefulness is an important part of why we suffer, because we want things to stay the same. But the reason they're changeful is because they're all interdependent and intertwined. And so that constant becoming of everything, we call it interdependent co-arising, is also kind of a source of not feeling like our thirst is satisfied. So everything interdependently co-arises. My teacher the first time I was taught that, it was called interdependent arising. But when I got a chance to write the slide, I made it interdependent co-arising because it's more interdependent. Does that make sense? Because they're co-arising. The Buddha saw that everything is kind of made up of, fan's going to come on, these 5 elemental qualities. Instead of essence of book, essence is not there. Everything is made up of form, sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. It's quite interesting because the Buddha is saying that part of the book is consciousness. Well, I thought it was just a book. In a materialist culture like we live in, it's easy for us to say, well, that's stupid, it's just a book. But the fact that you know it's a book, and that you sense it with your eyes, perceive it as a coherent object separate from me, it fits into a mental formation or kind of a prejudice, like things what are shaped like this you think are books. If I opened this up and it had some jewels in it, you'd realize it was a special safe, right? They make pretend book safes, right? It's a book, it's a safe. Which is it? Well, your materialist view is now kind of fallen apart. The last piece is consciousness. At some point, we're actually aware of this object and its relationship to me and its relationship to the light in the room and all these things. So everything that we call a thing actually has these 5 contributing skandhas, or the Buddha called them heaps so that people wouldn't elevate them. When you say essence of book, it elevates that to some kind of eternal, Buddha was trying to avoid that, so he called them heaps, or skandhas. It comes up a lot. Form, sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. And I usually remember 4 of them pretty well, and I always I'll drop one or the other. I'll remember form, sensation, I get to mental formation and consciousness, and I forget that after you sense something, you have to perceive it. Well, okay, it's fine. A lot of lists in Buddhism, that is because at the time of the Buddha, there was not really common writing, really a couple hundred years before the Buddha's ideas were written down. So they were all chanted, spoken to each other over and over again. And so lists are very useful to remember things by. I think people in med school have all kinds of these list things and mnemonic things to remember by. So that's the reason we have all these wonderful lists. But the non-self nature of everything, that makes sense, because even the form, we recognize the form and shape of the book, but the material it's made from, it comes from something else. There's all these, even though the book looks like it's a separate thing right here, there's all these other threads in the universe that flow together into the object in my hand to make it seem like an object in my hand. If you were looking like with some kind of fancy subatomic eyes, everything would just look like a cloud, right? We know most things, everything is open space. And even an atom has a nucleus and then the electrons spinning around it. Most of it is open space, which is pretty weird because everything looks quite solid and separate, but it actually isn't. Everything is just these weird clouds of stuff. I say weird clouds of stuff, but actually clouds of stuff look like this to us. But that's part of our perception and mental formation. It would be possible, like in the Matrix movies, remember when he gets his eyes burned out but he can still see everything? Maybe that was sort of like him seeing things as their energetic cloud instead of as separate self-existent entities, which is a delusion, a mistake that results in us suffering. Do those five heaps sort of make sense? I feel as though we're probably going to make it through most of these, certainly the Four Noble Truths, and into the Eightfold Path. We usually take a human comfort break. So, does anybody need a break? Should we take a minute? Oh, sure. Yeah, that's fine. It's just down the hall. I'll pause for 2 minutes. There's tea and maybe there are even some cookies there by the door. Okay. Are we mostly all back? Don't see Randy, but... Oh. Okay. His ears are here. That's, so, the third noble truth, this wonderful idea that if you took away the cause of us not seeing the world joyfully, the joy just flows right in, is, the Buddha used this word nirodha. It means blowing out. So, I forgot to light the candle. If you have a candle burning, imagine, if you will, the candle flame is what we call our self. It's not really a soul. That would take us back to essence of book. You know, soul is essence of probably is essence of human. I don't know if, do people who believe in souls think dogs have souls? I don't know. Does anyone know? They don't? That seems very unfortunate to me, but okay. So that idea, essentialist, is the philosophical category that believing in those permanent thingies, souls, selves. The Buddha, he says non-self. So it's not that there's no self. That would be an absolute materialist view. He rejected that. And he also said that the atta is not a permanent soul thing. In Hinduism, the atta is separated from Brahman, which is like the big super god energy, and what all of our spiritual questing is about is for our little piece of God energy to return and reconnect. And that's why the purification was a big part of Hinduism that the Buddha studied. So those are two extremes. There's nothing in you. You're just an object. You're just the same as this. That's the materialist view. And then there's an essentialist view that says that you have this permanent, wonderful spirit thing that will last forever and can interconnect with the creator of the universe energy. Those are two extremes. The Buddha's way is a middle way. So what the Buddha saw in his enlightenment was that really our self is kind of a reaction, a counter-reaction, a self-propagating delusion of separateness, kind of like a candle flame. It's a dynamic process, and we misidentify it as a permanent thing, but there are really no permanent things, because permanence isn't a thing, and all things interrelate with every other thing, the sun, the tree, the water, gravity. I mean, you don't have books without gravity. So if you could break the moment, and this chain reaction thing that we call our self goes onward. But if you can break the moment, or it goes out. And then once it's gone, it's gone. It doesn't, like, if you blow out the candle, it doesn't go back on. So that sense, that's what Nirodha is about. If you can break the cycle of self-delusion, you're enlightened. It's done. It's a wonderful experience. Now, for us who aren't enlightened, it sounds kind of scary, because, wait a second, are you saying like I'm going to blow my brains out? No. It's no self-destruction involved with this. But I did describe destructing a self. Ooh, no, I didn't mean that. There's a delusion of separateness, and that can melt away, and it can happen in an instant. Some of our Tibetan Buddhist friends do this. This is a shocking sound. And other forms of Buddhism have kind of an incremental dissolution process that they describe, like 48 stages of dissolution of the self. The point is that self, wanting things, thirsting after things to be different than they are, the biggest thing the self wants is for it to be permanent. but it isn't actually permanent. But it wants to think it's permanent, or it thinks it is permanent, and it wants everything to act like it's permanent. So when your car gets a scratch, it's proof that yourself isn't permanent, because that thing, that car, which is an expression of yourself, right, if your identity isn't described by your car, what is, right? But then it got a scratch in it, so it changed. But wait a second, if I'm permanently me, so the self goes through all these kind of struggle. That's the constant dukkha. That's the real deep down. That's the constant dukkha, uncomfortableness that we go through, is that we're really basing our sense of me around a misguided idea, and it doesn't quite fit with reality. And every time it doesn't quite fit with reality, it takes energy out of whatever we could be enjoying in life, and we have to put it back into propping up the false narrative that we're separate and alone or heroic, or there are a lot of different separate stories we prop up. So this nirodha idea is to take that cause away. With the candle, I took away, I don't know what I took away. I broke that chain reaction. I blew on it, so that took away the heat, let's say, and then it does not continue. So. The practices that the Buddha followed at the time were deep meditative practices. But after the Buddha started teaching, the Buddha taught many different practices that kind of chisel away, or maybe melt is a better word. If the self is kind of an ice sculpture, and water is the true nature of being, and also the true nature of us, as opposed to being separate, we're like little ice cubes floating around in the ocean. If we would just relax and melt, it would be okay. We'd be connected with everything. Now, don't worry that means you'd be crazy or something like that. That's not the case. Enlightened ones, the Buddha is one example, actually can see everything much more clearly and more accurately than we can, because we're deluded by this separateness artifact. And it divides us, it makes us conflict with each other, is the source of all the troubles that we experience. So, the big question though, what does this? The big answer is the Eightfold Path. That's the reason the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path, was to help folks get through and out the other side, to go from absolute selfishness. I mean, in the time of the Buddha, even 20 years ago, the idea of holding a camera and taking a picture of yourself would have been really a cause for grave concern by your parents, grave concern for your friends at work. It's just kooky to take pictures of yourself, right? Turns out there's a word for it now. So that's that's an example of things going in the wrong direction from a Buddhist point of view. So, but these Eightfold Path practices take us away from that, away from feeling separate, away from seeing the world as made up of separate, self-existent entities, and that's what the Buddha taught, the method of being a Buddhist. Now, here I have written right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right quietude. That is the whole list of the Eightfold Path. Usually when we talk about it, in sutras, the Buddha talked about this. Well, okay, so this sounds very strident. Right. I mean, there's no other word for it. So we say, around here, we say just right. Like when a bird, like a hawk or an eagle, flies up to a tree. They fly up to the tree. Now, they could crash into the tree, but they really seldom do. What they usually do is they come up and they alight just so, just right. They don't have too much speed or too little. Obviously, if you have too little speed and you try to land on a branch, you fall over backwards. If you have too much, you fall over forwards or break the branch. But if you ever watched, I mean, anytime you get a chance, do it. Even little birds, it's amazing. They'll just come and flit and they'll just land just right on the branch. And that's the same thing, our understanding can be just right. Not too much of this, not too much of that. The way we think about things can have that same kind of skillful quality, but natural. Right speech, what we think, what we say, and what we do are very closely connected. Often we will think, why'd that guy scratch my car? And then we'll say, why'd you scratch my car? Oh, this is an action. You'd say, why'd you scratch my car? And then you start with a physical action in response to that. That's a normal cascade. It often is very problematic. And if at any time you can intercept that, it's good. Because if we're flying into a rage, has anyone ever been angry? Okay. You've felt this process millions of times, and yet you don't really have control over it, and you don't really have a sense of where are the knobs and dials to control this. Life doesn't give us those things. Only reflection gives us those things. And the teachings of a wonderful teacher gives us those senses of what goes into this. Well, the Buddha is teaching us that right here. The way we think about things matters. If we practice thinking about everything as an interrelated quantity, a part of this whole wonderful swirling mist of being, we experience everything differently. And once we practice thinking that way, even if something is simple as not thinking nasty thoughts about people, as soon as you think a nasty thought about someone, the practice is to fold backwards on it with some positive thing. I could think, I'm a 49ers fan. I grew up in the area, so that was a thing. So if I think about the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, I could just feel the seething anger start to build in me, right? But I can think, but he throws a ball pretty good, and he's got good legs. He can run around. And I can see that if you were from Dallas, you'd think he's probably pretty great. I can kind of open to that and let go of the seething anger thing, because I can't tell you how many times we got in the playoffs and Dallas knocked us out. I hated that. And the fact that we won last time is great, but that one call was a little shifty. Okay, sorry. Okay. So thought, speech, and action, that's a really important crux, because action, the word action in Pali is karma. So, or in Sanskrit, technically, in Pali, it's kama. But karma, we know sort of what karma is. We'll talk about it. Our actions actually make us into who we are and condition our sense. Our actions create the karmic consciousness. That thing, the delusion that goes forward of separate selfness, is built by our actions. So if we start choosing actions that are skillful, wholesome, good, virtuous, then that, the tight, separate, exclusivist, whatever you want to call, ball of our self-delusion relaxes and melts a little bit. So that is an important thought, speech, action, those connections in the Eightfold Path, very important. The fifth one is part of that too, right? Livelihood. I mean, whatever you do for a living, you do most of the time. In the time of the Buddha, people who farmed, for instance, farmed from before the sun came up to just after the sun went down, and every day. And the idea of 7 days a week was irrelevant. You just had to work and work and work, and maybe your family would survive the winter. That's the way our human species has grown up. Now, we're in this weird time frame where I don't know where all these people went, but it seems like every single store everywhere has a sign in the window that says, help wanted. I still go to work, and I'm sure some of you still go to work, but where did all the people go? It's a mystery. But livelihood is important because, especially at the time of the Buddha, you spent most of your waking hours doing whatever you do. So if you spend most of your waking hours formulating poison to kill people, that is not good. That will create a stain or unfortunate elements in your karmic consciousness that will go onward. So they will plant seeds of karma, and then those will bear fruit, unfortunate fruit, later. And if you can recognize that what you're, and even within a job, it's possible. Like if you're selling used automobiles, You can do that in a wholesome and constructive way, or you can do it in a very destructive way, like don't tell people that the wheel's going to fall off, and just, haha, I got that sucker, so I bought that piece of crap. I can sell anything to anybody. Okay, that's unfortunate. That will get you in the end. Well, the fruits of that those actions will bear fruit. That's the way we say it. But you could also sell used automobiles in a helpful, constructive way and show people this is what you need, and I understand how automobiles work, and you can probably handle this one because, Ferraris have 17 forward gears, and I don't think you should get something with an automatic in it. You could be a constructive and helpful salesperson, right? So within the skillful, virtuous qualities can exist within almost any livelihood. Even protecting a nation, it's possible to do that in a wholesome way, but there are lines that get crossed. The Buddha was very adamant that selling other human beings was not ever going to be right livelihood. You couldn't be a good slaver. Manufacturing weapons was kind of on his list of not good, but I don't understand how, if the police protect people and they have to use a weapon sometimes, then if you make the weapons the police use, then it seems like that would be okay. And yet the Buddha said that making weapons was inherently bad. So, right livelihood. Did I say before that I didn't have all the answers and I'm just I'm with you, I'm learning this as we go? That's important to recognize. So sometimes the answer to your question is, I don't know, we should think about that. So these are forms of action. This is your framework of understanding. And then the last three have to do maybe with practice or with reflection. The first one, right, effort, to start to change the way you look at the world from I, me, my, or it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, it's kill or be killed. Okay, that's a very selfish, law of the jungle kind of way of thinking about life. To change that and to move in another direction, it takes effort. We are who we are because of the circumstances of our life. Once this comes to consciousness, once our spiritual quest kind of ignites itself in us, then we have to put effort in. You've all made the wonderful effort of coming to the temple. Some of you will be intrigued and interested. Some of you will be disappointed. That is not my problem, really. It's your life. It's living itself. I'm doing my best, too. So I'm putting in right effort to be here and to share. But coming back, trying other things, maybe in a Buddhist context, that's kind of up to you. And it takes real effort. A lot of times the Buddha will use the phrase, against the stream. Thinking of each other in a loving, peaceful way, and being able to feel the joy of someone else getting what they want. Feeling the joy of the Dallas Cowboys winning the game. It's very hard because we're taught to hate that. So we have to put effort in to kind of do something that's against the stream. The general flow is kind of materialist, kind of separate, kind of dog-eat-dog. That's the general flow we live in. So we have to put in effort to see things in a more enlightened way, a more loving way, a more open way. To get there, we have the seventh piece, right mindfulness, just right mindfulness, let's say. And has anybody participated in a mindfulness practice? A few people, sure. And there's different kinds of meditation. Sometimes in schools, so they'll have somebody come in and do a mindfulness, like eating an orange or a tangerine. Thich Nhat Hanh has a wonderful experience where it's a guided meditation, essentially, of peeling a tangerine and eating it. It takes about 15 minutes. I don't know if you've ever taken 15 minutes to eat a tangerine, but I can usually scarf one about 2 minutes. If I peel. The point is that if we take the time, maybe slow down, and really connect with the world around us, the way the Buddha taught, in this mindfulness quality, will start to change our mind. It will start to change the way we see things. We'll start to see that separateness is not actually the way things are, that interconnection is actually the way things are, and that my mental formations actually are coloring everything, and I can maybe not hold them quite so tightly and open up to the possibility that somebody who's different from me can actually be a quite wonderful person, even though I didn't know that. It's easy. We've all of us are, as a human community, kind of grew up in little tiny tribes. And the little tiny tribes couldn't exist without the destruction of the other tribes, or at least getting all the resources away from them, whoever them is, right? So all those problems have actually passed, but we still act like they're still true. And it's a painful, difficult time. Now, not that wars and everything don't happen. They are happening. But they're happening because of that misunderstanding, that delusion. If mindfulness was present and you could see that everybody needed some of the water and you'd share the water in the river instead of fighting over it, everybody would be better off. It would be better for life, So, right mindfulness. The last one, right quietude, is interesting because it gets translated as concentration, but concentration isn't the right word. Samadhi has more to do with opening to everything, like being an absolute observer, an observer to the point where you kind of melt away. That's what quietude or samadhi is about. Now, our culture and our time does not allow for a lot of quiet time. We can maybe schedule it in, but I can have 15 minutes of quiet time. Usually, if you find yourself with 15 minutes, you think, 15 minutes before I have to go. What could I get done in that time? And we become like the human doings instead of the human beings. So, seeking out quietude is important. In the way that the Buddha structured his ashram or his schools was people would get up in the morning pretty early, do some chores, go out, beg for food. We don't do that exactly here. We just have a donation basket and people donate things and we eat. But get food, they'd eat. There might be a class, a meditation class, and then the whole afternoon, there were no more meals. There was tea time, but that's really not a meal. Until late in the night would be practice time. Sitting meditation, maybe with a Dharma talk in the evening, and then more meditation. So there was just tons of time of quietude, of just sitting. Very famous people have done this. Carl Jung, the psychologist, worked very hard. He was trying to be a good Freudian, and then he got to this point where it just didn't work for him anymore, and he kind of checked out. He literally, he had a villa on Lake Geneva, but he didn't go to the office anymore. He didn't have any more appointments. He spent a whole year walking on the beach of the lake. And it's not that big a lake. It doesn't really have big waves or anything. It's not like going to the ocean. It's just a lake. And he just thought about things. He calls it his creative illness, but in fact, his whole wonderful explanation or understanding of human beings and how their psyche works came from the time he just checked out and let it be. And then let understanding bubble up. The famous story of him making a sandcastle is like, oh, okay, So, but for all of us, sometimes taking the time, that's why vacations are supposed to be important, except then we plan the vacation with all the activities, and so the chance of actually having quiet time on the beach, watching the waves for a long time, and starting to see, if you stop and watch, you start to see things that you never see otherwise. You start to see that there are patterns in the waves, and yet they're all distinct. Well, that insight could be a wonderful, amazing spiritual step forward for you. But if we don't take the time and sit quietly, without interruption, even without the chatter of thoughts, we won't have those insights. So that's the last piece of the Eightfold Path. Do those make sense? We might dig into them deeper, but yes?
Sorry, can I ask what are your own daily practices to stay on the path?
Certainly, you're welcome to ask. No, so at the temple, it's different because it's a temple. Every morning we chant the Shoshinge at the altar. So there's a time of quiet, and we focus on the chanting. Then there's some chores that we do, and then temple work. And then the afternoon, there's another chanting session. The big one is on Tuesdays, but each day, at the end of the day, kind of before, we don't have dinner, we eat breakfast and lunch, which is kind of the Buddhist pattern. That leaves more time in the afternoon for this kind of thing, for just being. There's usually time for reading and study, but a lot of the reading and study is directed. I'm working on the Dharma talk, so I read this thing. As opposed to when I say, I wonder what that's about. I'll just read it. That also occurs. There's space for that. So mostly the time of chanting in the Hondo is the most concentrated practice. I used to be a big meditator when I was younger, and I think I thought that if I did it hard enough, I would get enlightened, which is a little embarrassing, but it's true. But I've kind of let that go a little bit. You know, it'll come when it comes, and that's okay. Being at peace with things, it turns out, it's like the old finger trap you used to get in Chinatown. You can't see the finger trap, you can only see the fingers, but I can see the finger trap. And it's a wicker thing with the spiral weaving, and when you pull on it, the energy of pulling traps you. And the only way to be untrapped is to relax about it. So that relaxing about things each day is an important practice, but that can happen in a lot of ways. Sometimes we use the phrase deep hearing of the light. It's an odd, but I do that every day. And to describe what that is, it has to do with quietude and observation, but to see the wise, compassionate quality of everything around us, you have to look at it and observe. So it might just be looking at the bark of the tree out front, or it might be going on a grand hike to the top of a mountain to look at a big vista, those kinds of things. Another question, Eightfold Path-ish or other? Yes?
Before you mentioned Carl Jung, I was kind of thinking of the ego and non-self. Did he study Buddhism? And is that ego part related to what the Buddha thought about itself?
Interesting. So Jung would have been aware Buddhism existed, but I don't know that he had any particular affinity. More modern psychologists are actually practically ripping off Buddhism hand over fist, and with the mindfulness stuff and different kind of behavioral psychology relates a lot, because the Buddha is saying what you do becomes who you are. That relates. Jung's concepts of different constructs, or he used the word complex, but not like an illness, just that each of us would have many aspects in our personality. It doesn't really resonate that much with Buddhism. It does in the sense that those are changeful things, and the fact that Jung saw what we've experienced as ourself as made out of all kinds of little bits does resonate okay, connects to Buddhism in a way, but there's no direct connection. I actually studied a lot of Jungian thought in college, a long time ago, but still, and I use it in this context, as a priest. A lot of those ideas bubble up, from both Freud and Jung. If you didn't have an ego, you'd be crazy. That's their point of view, that you must have an adequately strong ego. Not too strong, not too weak, right? Well, then that kind of is a middle way-ish feeling from the Buddhist point of view. But the Buddha is saying something much more radical, that those constructs that we experience as normal are illness, and that they can be let go, and we can experience the wonderfulness of reality without them. The unenlightened psychologist would never say that. So. And the Buddha is kind of saying that when we I often, for that one, I use the analogy of a drop of water falling into Lake Tahoe. If you've ever gone canoeing in Lake Tahoe early in the morning, you'll notice that little beads of water fall off your paddle and skitter across the surface of the lake. Now, are those little pieces of water Lake Tahoe? No, they're pieces of water. Well, but where'd they come from? Lake Tahoe. So are they Lake Tahoe? You can keep asking that kind of question. But it's because of surface tension and a bunch of neat physics. But anyway, they skitter across for a while, and they can do two things. They can either evaporate before they go back into the lake, which is pretty wild, or they can just go back into the lake. At some point, the surface tension of the ball and the surface of the lake equals, and then it just... So that ball of water becomes one with the lake. Imagine that's like what enlightenment is. So the separateness of the ball is our ego construct around our personality, and when we can let that go, nirodha, the third noble truth, then we can reconnect with everything. Now, the next question is the ball of water gone? Well, no, that would be ridiculous. The ball of water can't be gone, and yet you can't really see it or find it. I mean, even measuring it would be a challenge. I guess if you weighed all of Lake Tahoe, no, but the ball was floating on Lake Tahoe before. You know, it's a puzzle. That idea, though, that what was that separate ball of water, that ego self, when it has completely interconnected and diffused into reality, so when a Buddha is enlightened and goes into the great and complete nirvana, the Mahaparinibbana, that's when a Buddha dies. There's a nirvana when they get enlightenment, and then when their body dies, that's the great and complete nirvana. Where'd they go then? We all get reborn because we're stuck in this delusion state, and we get reborn, reborn, reborn. Once you don't do that anymore, you're gone, gone, gone beyond, gone far beyond. That's gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate. And yet you don't go anywhere else. You're still here. It's wonderfully puzzling. And it's very difficult to talk about what happens after a Buddha is enlightened. Even the Buddha seldom talked about it because it was so hard to talk about. So, okay, that was a Jungian question, and I'm talking about enlightenment. Interesting. Okay. Now, these are sort of the big ideas of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, and it's kind of a trick because there's Four Noble Truths, but the fourth Noble Truth is the Eightfold Path. So it's not quite 12 things, but it sure seems like it. That's what I think Buddhism is mostly about. Was there anything about... Here, let me go here. Any big ideas about Buddhism that you feel like I didn't touch on?
Is the Buddhism practice here at the temple considered a religion?
By who? That's the question. That's the answer to your question. It depends. People who have been part of theistic religions, strongly theistic religions with like begging to the Sky Father to not ruin their day and making various propitiations or giving gifts to keep the Sky Father from ruining their business, would think this is not a religion. It doesn't even have God in it. How could it be a religion? They would say that. People who have a broader definition, I mean, my definition of religion is a worldview. It's just the framework you look at the world with. People in Hollywood have a religion. It's materialist, youthfulist. I can't think of any other nice things to say about it. It's problematic. I mean, that guy, what was that actor that accidentally shot, a terrible accident, accidentally shot his friend, the director? Yeah, that guy donates tons of money to anti-gun causes. Okay, that's crazy. How can you make your money waving guns around in movies and then think they're bad? Get coherent here. It's a Hollywood thing, not about guns. I think guns are very dangerous, and only people who know what they're doing should ever have any access to such things. But that's a religion to me. Hollywood's a weirdness thing. It has to do with all of American culture, but then the whole cult of being famous. Like no matter what you do, if it makes you famous, it's good.
I think worship is sort of maybe a foundation of, I don't think you
Right. You could say that religions are things that worship things. Dr. Matsunaga talked about blind faith. Things that, worldviews that operate on the basis of blind faith, maybe that's a religion. And then worldviews that are based on some rational elements, using observation. I mean, this is sounding kind of scientific. Buddha's kind of scientific. He does talk about spirits and all kinds of other stuff. But, I mean, all these things are measurable because he has experienced them. Whether they're subjectively, objectively measurable from machines is a different quantity. But there's a lot of things that are quite scientific about Buddhism. So you could say that it's a scientific approach to helping sentient beings operate their mind. So it's not a religion at all. But then somebody could probably argue the same thing about Christianity if they tried hard enough. So I would not put that weight on this temple. Sometimes we call it a temple. Often we call it Reno Buddhist Center. We changed it from Reno Buddhist Church. When Matsunaga first started, he called it Reno Buddhist Church because he figured no one would come if he didn't say it was a church, which is sort of true. But then there were some people that didn't come because it had the word church on it. When I first came, there were still a few crosses here and there still are several crosses from before, because it was a Christian church before, in several different incarnations, as a matter of fact. But it turned out there was some baggage with the word church that things really work much better when we call it a Buddhist center, and Buddhist stuff can happen here, and it can be quite devotional and religious, and you know, worship is okay if it's worship. If you're valuing something, maybe that's what worship means. But when you start to think that the statue of Amida Buddha has magic juju and it's going to make you get a good score on your exams, well, that's kind of magical thinking, and that is not what we think about. We have these statues and images to focus our mind. We are shaped like this, so the statue of the Buddha is shaped like that. But in fact, the Buddha is gone beyond, gone far beyond. The Buddha exists in an energetic plane that I can't really understand. I can kind of touch it. So it's an interesting question. The label is less interesting than the process of trying to answer it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm fascinated and unknowledgeable about the principle of death.
Uh-huh.
I'm fascinated. I think
We will get to that next time. Yeah, so the Buddha did die, 80-something years old. Some people say 88, and people argue, by the side of the road of dysentery, or maybe, what do you call the kind of poison botulism from eating bad mushrooms? Somebody have a medical background, you know what happens what kills you when you eat bad mushrooms. Okay. He did not sail to heaven on a shining steed, which is a wonderful story, but the Buddha died by the side of the road, 80 years old with dysentery. It probably smelled bad when he died. That's an interesting story, and we will touch on that. But it does speak to the non-magicalness of the Buddha. I mean, if the Buddha was the magic, whatever, emanation of the god Brahma, wouldn't it have been better? It wasn't. It was this kind of ignominious and painful thing. It took him 3 or 4 days to die of it, but
there's a book I'm interested in, the Tibetan book of Dharma. Is that online?
so different definitions of that book. I'm trying to think of there's a better translation than Tibetan Book of the Dead, or maybe the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying is a nice way to say it. It's mostly, our Tibetan friends in Buddhism have focused on this transition time between when we're born in this body and then our next birth. And other parts of Buddhism focus on other aspects. Some of them just focus on, that's nice, but let's just sit together and practice now. Not as focused on that. In Pure Land Buddhism, we focus on our next birth can be in the Pure Land of Amida Buddha if we just turn our consciousness in a slight way. It sounds passive and easy, but we're not really that capable of grand spiritual alchemy. So that's actually a very skillful way to move onward. Instead of trying to get enlightened now, just get everything squared away. It's like a football team. It's not that you're trying to win the Super Bowl this year. 4 years from now, you will win. You have to start getting players, building a coaching system, building everything, and then it will happen. That's okay. Then there's parts of Buddhism even more like that are over vast stretches of thousands of births. Don't worry about it. You won't get enlightened for 1,000 births. Well, how do you get people to come to the temple if you tell them that? And then there's other parts of Buddhism that say, if you come to the temple, you might get enlightened today. Special today, enlightenment. No, those things exist too. So that book is interesting, and it does focus around what happens to us when we die. If we die a peaceful death, is it different than if we die a violent death? The state of our consciousness when we die has some effect on where we go onward, how we remanifest, how are we reborn. So there are different systems inside of Buddhism. Often we describe Buddhism as a tree. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. See that tree? I put a tree there. Never mind. I pushed the button too many times. As a tree. So it's all connected, but yet this branch and that branch are different. You can tell two branches from a tree if you look at a tree. I have a lot of trees around, but so that is part of all Buddhism. And interestingly, often Buddhism is mostly associated with that transition time. In China and Japan, very strong, like the most important parts of Buddhist temples' contribution to society have to do with handling death. So we'll talk about that. Okay, we're about to the end of our time together. I was going to talk a little bit about karma, but I did touch on it, right? And we'll save up, okay, we'll save those extra bits to fill in time next time. So the last piece is, according to our plan, the next session will be next Saturday at 10 o'clock, The Life of Shakyamuni Buddha. If you could read in the book, that would be helpful. I kind of don't follow exactly with the book. I went to a strange liberal arts college, and they just told you to read books, and then they lectured, and it was up to you to find the interconnections. So I haven't been really taught how to, like, Chapter 2, Section 1, worksheet. I don't know how to do that. So if you could read the sections, Section 2 about the Dharma 38 to 75, that's helpful. And as an exercise, if you could pick something in there that speaks to you. So bring it back with you, put a Post-it or otherwise and annotate. Obviously, if it's not a physical book, there's not a real Post-it, but in e-readers, there's some way to make a bookmark or note. Choose something that's interesting to you that we could share, and then we'll try to maybe split up in a few groups and share them, or maybe we'll just share them all together. A few people will share, but that's what we're going to do for next time. So if you received a link to the book and you like e-reading of large PDF files, that's good. If you need a physical book, we have some here. Usually people donate at least $5 because that's what they cost, but some amount in the interest of the book. Also, the class, as I mentioned, every morning in the Buddha's daily routine, he would go out and beg for food. That was great because it meant that the Sangha, the priests, would never be separate from the people. We would never be talking about something everybody wasn't interested in, because if those people on the hill were talking about some stuff you're not interested in, why would you give them food, right? We do not do that, however. We have a basket. It is over there. People generously donate something each time they come to the temple. That's our custom. So thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you next time.